It's Sunday, 3rd November 2024. This is Nation Watch. I'm your host, Mervyn Williams. Welcome as we continue our conversation on the list and the census. My guest today is Mr. Vincent Alexander, AA, Commissioner of the Guyana Elections Commission, and the gentleman who is making the lives of the PPP leadership quite uncomfortable with facts. And it is alleged that he has not produced any evidence, but today we will. Welcome, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you very much, Mervyn.
Mr. Alexander, a quick comment from you. There is obvious delay, some say deliberate, on the part of the government when it comes to releasing the report on Census 2022. We've been receiving some information unofficially, which suggests that Guyana's population in 2022 was down to 750,000 and below. We received information that particularly the East Indian population has declined to somewhere in the region of 30% of the national population, whereas the indigenous population has continued to grow. Do you, sir, see any relationship between these leaked numbers, which we have not been yet able to verify, and the government's dilly-dallying as it relates to releasing the official reports?
Mervyn, the numbers of the census are important because the number of the census refers to how many Guyanese are actually resident. And the difficulties we are faced with is that we have a National Register of Registrants that includes Guyanese who are overseas. And when you come to elections, the issue is how many of those Guyanese are actually in the country for the purpose of voting, given the fact that there's evidence that people who are not present are voted for. So the census gives you an idea of what the turnout is likely, the actual turnout is likely to be, and can point to the fact that there are votes cast in excess of the actual population.
It is clear that the People's Progressive Party has embarked on a massive rigging scheme in the run-up to the regional and general elections, whenever they shall come, but no later than November 2nd, 2025, as constitutionally directed. There has been a continuous call from the parliamentary opposition, in fact, from the joint opposition, including the Working People's Alliance, which is not currently in parliament, for a clean voters list, for biometrics at the place of poll. This is being rejected. This has been and continues to be rejected by this new People's Progressive Party since 2020. We're going to give our viewers a look at what the People's Progressive Party's position was immediately after they lost the 2015 regional general elections. The General Secretary of the People's Progressive Party had a profound statement to make, having lost the elections of 2025. Let's listen. 2015, I beg your pardon. Well, of course, they will lose 2025 as well. So let's look at Bharat Jagdeo as he feebly calls for a clean voters list and biometrics, enhanced biometrics.
Make changes with our commissioners. We are going to argue for several changes at GECOM. First of all, we believe that Suraj Bali does not have what it takes to deliver free and fair elections.
And this is since the last election?
Yes, we believe that he has succumbed to pressure, that he has allowed this institution to act in a partisan manner, and he is in charge. You can't put the blame on the chief elections officer. He's in charge of GECOM, and therefore the party has called for him to resign. But further to that, we need to make sure that the list is cleaned up so that people, the abuse that we had where when you had sympathetic presiding officers to the opposition, allowing people who should not have voted to vote because they had extra ballots for people who had migrated and were or are dead in the polling stations, that if you have a new clean list, that will minimize that happening because they would not have the ballots in the polling station. Secondly, we need enhanced biometrics. Because when some presiding officers said, like we had some cases in Victoria, this is Mr. X, just looking at the photo, and the polling agent from the party sits across the room or is in a hostile area, is afraid to object, they allowed a number of people to vote who should not have voted. But if you have biometrics, enhanced biometrics outside of just a photo ID, it could minimize that happening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett Jagdeo, for those very instructive words. Mr. Alexander, Jagdeo speaks of a clean voters list. He speaks of enhanced biometrics. He speaks of the former chairman of the Elections Commission having succumbed to pressure. And he speaks of persons being allowed to vote for persons in the names of persons who are overseas and who are dead. The situation that we have now seems to be the one that Mr. Jagdeo is speaking about.
Well, what Mr. Jagdeo said in 2015 is relevant today, but on the feet of the other side. So, in essence, what he said is relevant, but the case is now being argued on the other side. And in fact, the counter-argument is now coming from Jagdeo's side. So he's now counter-arguing himself. And so is Anil Nandalal.
Well, it's interesting, is it not, Mr. Alexander, that he asserted then that Surge Bali, Dr. Steve Surge Bali is the person he's referring to. I believe the most impartial and perhaps the fairest of the commissioners we've had within recent times, chairs of the commission that we've had within recent times, with his record of working towards agreements as opposed to voting for a particular side. What we have now is a chairman of the Elections Commission who is voting exclusively on the side of the governing party. How does that argument hold, given Madam Claudette Singh's, Justice Claudette Singh's position? Should she not go on the basis of the same argument that Jagdeo has proffered?
Well, as I just said, the case that Barrett argued in 2015 is pertinent today. And we do have a situation in GECOM, particularly subsequent to the 2020 elections, where on every occasion, the chairperson has voted with the PPP commissioners in the decision-making process. Now, voting with those commissioners or with any set of commissioners is not naturally a problem. What is the problem is when one looks at the rationale given for the vote. The rationale cannot stand scrutiny and clearly seeks to collude with the PPP.
I want to introduce to this conversation, Mr. Alexander, Anil Nandalal's arguments, which conflict with Jagdeo's 2015 position regarding biometrics. Nandalal argues that there is already biometrics in the system, that Ghana is not ready for what he calls electronic voting, and electronic voting really is something that Nandalal himself has introduced to the conversation. As far as we're aware, the Ghana Elections Commission is considering, or ought to consider in a few days, the question of biometrics at the place of poll for the purposes of identification. But let's listen to Anil Nandalal on the question of a clean voters list and biometrics. Bear in mind, viewers, that this gentleman was responsible for the East Coast area, representing the People's Progressive Party in the 2020 elections. And under his watch, as the person responsible for the PPP's operations, there were 47 ballot boxes which were devoid of any of the required statutory documents in them, and those boxes were set aside not to be counted until somebody woke up one morning and decided they will be counted and included in the official results. Here's Nandlal.
We have biometrics already. Are you telling me that if I, Mohabir Adil Nandlal, turns up at the polling station, I have my ID, my name is on the list, the folio that the GECOM staff has and all the polling agent has, conforms with my ID. I am that person. The photograph is me. If I go and I put my finger on the machine, and for whatever reason the machine malfunctions, you're telling me that I will be denied my right to vote? You are telling me that I will be denied my right to vote? That is what I am not opposed to any form of technology. But the manual system is working. Why you want to resort to technology?
Right, so this is Anil Nandlal, Guyana's Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, who has taken the bold step to digitize the records at the deeds registry and the land registry throughout the entire court system, but refuses to consider the practicality of digitizing fingerprints for the purpose of identifying voters in the Guyana electoral process. Mr. Alexander?
Let's start by looking at the statement that the manual system has worked. This is not what the PPP and Jagdeo in particular said after 2015.
Precisely.
And what Jagdeo said is instructive. He said that a presiding officer who is predisposed can facilitate someone who is not entitled to vote, to cast his vote. Why is it now different? Why is it now the system works when we still have the human factor, which I've always contended is the factor that can cause the problems in our system? The very accusation against Mingo tells you that you're pointing to the human factor, all the accusations. So no matter how good the present system is, the human factor has the possibility of an intervention in the system, as Jagdeo argued in 2015, and has obviously continued to be the case in 2020, because what occurred in 2020, for which there is evidence, unlike what Nandlal says, there were persons who were voted for who were not in the country, and therefore the human factor had to be at play. It is in that context that one turns to technology, because what technology can do is reduce the level to which decision-making is purely in the hands of the human factor. And that's the purpose that enhanced biometrics, and I'm using Jagdeo's words, can serve. If you have a system where a machine determines whether the person who's turned up is that person whose fingerprints are on record, and that machine literally either does not allow the person to go forward to vote, or makes a sound in the place that says this person has not been verified, then the human factor is left out of the equation, and technology is allowed. Of course, technology engineered by human beings is not technology from heaven or hell. It's technology engineered by human beings. It's allowed to be that objective, impartial mechanism for the determination of who can vote and who cannot vote.
But
and let me go a little further.
Sure.
In any of these systems, there are mechanisms in place for the failure of the technology. There are mechanisms in place, so that this broad statement about technology is also irrelevant because there are mechanisms in place. One of the failures that Nandalal referred to is power failure. Well, that's the most ridiculous example. Why? First of all, these systems come with their own power pack. So the chances are you don't even have to link them up to GPL. So GPL's power failure has nothing to do. And even if they link to GPL power failure, they have the backup power pack that kicks in immediately that GPL kicks out.
But more importantly, Mr. Alexander, is the fact that it's apparent that Mr. Nandlal has not listened to or read carefully your articulation on this issue. I do not recall you or any opposition personality making the point that this system involves rejecting prints at the place of poll. You've made it clear, as I recall it, that at registration, electronic registration, if the prints are not properly taken, they will be rejected at that point and corrective measures will have to be taken immediately, so that when this person turns up to vote at a future date, the prints electronically captured and stored are all good and will result in the identification of the real person to whom those prints belong. Nandlal here is suggesting that he can turn up, or someone can turn up and put their hand there or their fingers there and be rejected. I mean, it doesn't sound like an argument coming from a rookie attorney at law, much less an attorney general.
Mervyn, you're correct. When we talk about biometrics, enhanced biometrics, we're talking about two things. The first thing we're talking about is capturing the fingerprints digitally. And that is superior to the manual capture of the fingerprints, which he referred to when he says we already have biometrics. Because when you're capturing fingerprints digitally, the mechanism, the equipment that does the capturing rejects a print if it is not perfect. In other words, if you don't place your hand properly on the machine, there's a certain density of capture that has to take place. And if that density does not occur, it rejects that attempt until you properly place your hands and the standards required for a proper print are observed. Then the print is captured. So it means at the capture of print, you're dealing with 100% perfection. The other area of concern is the identification, the use of the prints at the place of poll. Again, at the place of poll, when you place your hands, if you don't place them properly to get a corresponding print, the buzzer can go off and says, well, something is wrong. I personally have had the experience at JFK where I have put my fingers down and the guy says to me, press hard or straighten your finger or something so that the perfect print can be had to match what's in the machine. So that's the first point I want to make. That what the system seeks to do is to ensure that there's a match of perfect prints, both in terms of the finger prints that you are now placing in the machine and those that are stored. But I'm going on to say a little further that in these systems, even if there was a problem with that, there are mechanisms to determine that that person should cast his or her vote. For example, right now in our manual system, we allow for affidavits of identity if the ID card is not at play. So that the chances are that if you have a problem with fingerprints,
which wouldn't be likely, really.
Which is very unlikely, that you can resort to that affidavit so that that person could be taken to court if it is found subsequently that the person forged his identity for the purposes of voting. So there are mechanisms that can supplement the fingerprinting process. But we start off with the position that the fingerprinting process is superior to the manual process. The digital process is superior to the manual process because of the level of perfection of the prints. And the manual process we now have allows an individual, a person, to exercise his judgment. Is that the right person standing in front of me? And people do look similar. So one, is that the right person standing in front of me? And secondly, even if it's not the right person, what is my disposition as a political actor in allowing or not allowing that person? And that is what Jack Dio talked about. Allowing people in the system who are not supposed to be in because the actors, the human actors, are biased and are a part of the system of discriminating and corrupting the system. And there's much more that could be said about the manual system. These things that Mandalal talked about, which you didn't have a chance to play, about all these people being present in the polling station and all of that.
We're going to get to more of Mr. Nandlal, if you don't mind.
Well, I'll hope.
But I wanted to get from you on this program confirmation of two things. One, whether in fact GECOM has ever considered, or whether anyone you know about from the Guyana Elections Commission has ever discussed publicly the question of electronic voting, which Mr. Nandlal alluded to. And I believe that will come up in the next video. And whether the equipment that GECOM is considering or is likely to consider is of the type that Nandlal alludes to, which may have some set of glitches. My recollection is that GECOM is considering standalone equipment, self-powered equipment, and equipment that can function in any geographic space in the country, given its makeup.
All right. When we talk about electronic voting, which in fact Jack Dio mentioned.
Yes. Nandlal, I think it was.
Jack Dio mentioned electronic voting as well. It is far more than what we are advocating for. We are simply advocating for two things. That when people go to get registered, that the fingerprints are taken digitally, so we have a perfect register of people's fingerprints. That aspect GECOM has discussed in the past. And in its 1920 budget, or its 1990 budget, the administration of GECOM actually made provisions,
2019.
actually made provisions for us to acquire the equipment to start the process.
No, that was 2018 budget, I believe it was.
2018,
yes.
to start the process of taking fingerprints digitally. The administration actually identified the equipment, the technologies, and had a provision in the budget. At the last moment, that was rejected. And so what we had planned to embark on, the commissioners overruled it. And when I say the commissioners, I don't mean collectively. Essentially, the PDP commissioners
plus the
overruled it, plus the chair. The second aspect is being able to go to the place of poll and to have your fingerprints digitally matched. To have your fingerprints digitally matched, as is the case when you go to the immigration in the US and all over the world. and other electoral constituencies have your fingerprints digitally matched. Electronic voting is much more than that.
But this has not been discussed by GECOM.
We have not discussed
Okay.
electronic voting. Electronic voting is when the actual vote cast is electronic. So, for example, in Venezuela, when they go to vote, there is a slate with the names of the parties and the pictures. And what the voter simply does is to press the picture, and that vote is registered in the electronic system.
So the People's Progressive Party, through its main actors, Nandlala Jagdeo, have added to the pot electronic voting, obviously to confuse the conversation, to make it difficult to move forward. So for viewers, the issues have just been clarified by Mr. Alexander, that electronic voting is not on the agenda. It's simply electronically capturing fingerprints and using those electronically captured fingerprints for the identification of the voter at the place of poll.
Let me go to say further. Under the regime of Steve Shrewsbury, the Canadians did come with the technology for electronic voting. And in fact, that technology was used by the University of Guyana in its student elections. And what that provided for is you get a ballot paper, you mark the ballot paper. It is then, that ballot paper is then scanned into the electronic system. And that electronic system produces a count at the end of the day. The electronic system which the Canadians brought also provided for the electronic transmission of the results. And in fact, UG did use that as well. So we were able to have voting in Berbice and to transmit the results immediately to Turkine and to declare our results in one day. GECOM did not accept that proposal of electronic voting under the regime of Steve Shrewsbury.
Let's take a look at Guyana's Attorney General as he attacks Commissioner Alexander on the matter of elections in Guyana as the PPP racks up its massive rigging scheme, MRS, massive rigging scheme.
But since I'm on the election fraud cases, I should also comment on a contention which I see being repeated by Vincent Alexander with alarming frequency. Mr. Alexander, as you know, is an executive member of the People's National Congress and is their representative on the Guyana Elections Commission as a commissioner. Mr. Alexander has been writing profusely about a bloated list in existence, calling for a clean list, and in recent time has added another allegation to his repertoire. The allegation now that he's advancing is that there were many ballots cast in the March 2nd, 2020 elections in the names of persons who were not present. This is a bizarre contention. How is it possible for a ballot to be cast in the name of a person who is not present? It means that someone purported to be the person whose name is on the list. How is that possible, having regard to all the mechanisms that were present and in place at the polling place. And Alexander keeps repeating this bizarre allegation over and over again in the newspapers without producing a shred of evidence to support what he's saying.
Well, we are going to deal with the evidential side in a minute, Mr. Alexander. But speaking from personal knowledge, I know that Vincent Alexander, Commissioner, Guyana Elections Commission, has not been a member of any political party, least to mention the People's National Congress reform, for more than 20 years.
Much less an executive
Much
member.
less an executive member. Comment briefly on Mr. Nandlal's wild, wicked, mischievous assertion that you are a member of the executive.
It's not wild, it's wicked. It's not wild, it's wicked. It's pointed. You see, Nandlal and all that he is doing is dependent on a bogey about the PNC and rig elections. So that he's trying to put the viewer, the listener, into a frame of mind that does not allow them to be analytical and critical of what he says, because he's talking about a set of people who is rigged. And that's why he refers to me as an executive member. So he wants his listeners, who they have conditioned over the years to see the PNC as a rigging machine, to view what he says from the perspective or the disposition that he's talking about a rigger. So that they will not be analytical and critical about what Nandlal is saying. They will immediately sop it up because it's the truth coming from those who are righteous about those who are sinful. And that is why Nandlal seeks to suggest that I am an executive member of the PNC, which I have not been since 2007, at a time at which I also did not renew my membership, and therefore I don't even qualify to be an executive member of the PPP, of the PNC. But one also has to look at what he said about me representing the PNC. Nandlal is supposed to be the Attorney General of this country and the custodian on behalf of the state of the laws of Guyana. We know that everybody sees the commission as a highly politicized body because of the manner of its composition and because of the politics of Guyana. But the legal fact of the matter is that A, the commissioners are not representatives legally of anyone. The commissioners are nominees. And in this instance, nominees of the leader of the opposition after consultation with the opposition parties. So that they're not representatives, they are nominees. And so here again is Nandlal trying to condition the mind of people. Opposite to what the law provides for, commissioners being nominees and constitutional officers rather than representatives of political parties. But of course, he's right insofar as the commissioners of the People's Progressive Party have made it quite clear that they represent the party. They've made it quite clear. And so in actuality, that occurs. But he is, as I said, conditioning the minds of the listeners to believe that these guys have to be biased because they don't come to the table with clean hands. They come to the table representing a political interest. So he's creating an environment in which he can then put forward his false accusations and his misrepresentations and his fictitious information.
Wicked, indeed. Mr. Alexander, I want to get down to some evidence now. Evidence which Mr. Nandlal suggests that you or the PNC has never made public. We look now at a letter from the Guyana Elections Commission, Office of the Chairman, dated May 22nd, 2020, signed by Justice Claudette Singh, SC, CCH, Chairman, Guyana Elections Commission. It says it's addressed to the Commissioner of Police, Leslie James, DSS, Police Headquarters, Ivlery. The Commissioner, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is the Chief Immigration Officer, and it is in this capacity that he was written to. A letter says, Dear Commissioner, the APNUFC is alleging that persons whose names and dates of birth appear on the list attached had migrated and could not have exercised their franchise on March 2nd, 2020. In this regard, I shall be grateful if you will be so kind as to cause the Immigration Department to verify whether these persons were out of the country on March 2nd, 2020. Their respective polling divisions and stations where these persons allegedly voted are also identified on the list. The Commission would wish this matter to be urgently addressed. This is May 22nd, 2020. And in response, the Commissioner of Police, Leslie James, on the 27th of May 2020, replied to Justice Claudette Singh, SCCCH, Chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission, as follows. Dear Madam, I refer to your letter dated May 20th, 2020, and forward herewith report from Deputy Chief Immigration Officer for your information. And there's a list attached here. And on this list, the Chief Immigration Officer lists 172 names as persons who did not arrive or return on or before March 2nd, 2020. These persons were out of the country on March 2nd, 2020. 172 names. And he also attaches a list of 35 names, the names of 35 persons who he said did not depart before 2nd March 2020. In other words, these 35 persons were in the country. So of that list of 207, 35 persons were in fact in the country and so were entitled to vote.
Not only entitled, but
evidently voted. And the other 172 were not in the country, although votes were cast in their favor. There's another letter here responding, the Police Commissioner, Chief Immigration Officer, responding to Claudette Singh, retired Justice of the Appeal, on the 8th of June 2020, to another request for similar information. And he says, I refer to your letter dated May 31st, 2020, and forward herewith report from Deputy Chief Immigration Officer for your information. And on this list, the letter, could we have the second letter from the Office of the Police Commissioner on screen, please? Thank you. On this list, attached to this letter, I beg your pardon, is a list of the names of 211 persons. 211 persons who were in fact not in the country on March 2nd, 2020, although the evidence is that votes were cast in the names of these persons. And there's an attachment of a list of 99 names, the names of 99 persons who were in fact in the country and evidently voted. This, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence that the Elections Commission wrote to the Chief Immigration Officer, presented two lists, and got information that in one instance, 211 persons were not in the country and votes were cast for them. In another, 172 persons were not in the country and votes were cast in their names. Mr. Alexander, talk to us about this issue and take us down the path of Mr. Anil Nandlal writing to the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission, requesting and subsequently obtaining additional lists of names which were intended to be sent to the Chief Immigration Officer for similar scrutiny.
First of all, let me say the question that Nandalal posed was how persons could have voted with all of the mechanisms that are in place. And I would simply reference what Jagdeo said in this regard. Jagdeo argued that persons in 2015, I think, would have been able to vote because of the bias of the presiding officer. So that's the answer to you, Nandalal. The answer is right in Freedom House. Freedom House has the answer that the bias officials, notwithstanding all the mechanisms, would have been allowed to vote. And there's a lot more one can say about that, about who are the officials, how local they are, how intimidated political representatives are at the place of poll, etc. But two things. The PPP came to the conclusion that it was possible for this to occur. We have gone beyond that conjecture and now have evidence that it occurred. And therefore, this issue that is argued very often, even by other people other than the PPP, including certain news houses, that the system is perfect, is now a non-issue, because whether you think the system is perfect or not, here is evidence of the imperfection of the system. Here is the evidence. And what that evidence is, the APNU AFC used the period of the recount, and we need to observe this. This kind of information cannot become available in a normal count. Because in a normal count, all that occurs is that you count the ballots. You do not, and what you do, you correspond the number of ballots with the number of names ticked off. You don't try to determine the status of a person when you're doing the normal count. All you do is you count how many persons are ticked off, you count the ballots, and you say, well, the number of persons ticked off is equivalent to the number of ballots, and therefore we've accounted for all of the ballots. What if we counted was to provide the parties an opportunity in their field work to look to the list of persons who were recorded as voted and to see if those persons were actually in the country or alive. That's what the field work could have done. It is based on that field work and the knowledge of citizens and their movements that the party came up with this list challenging the names of those persons who were recorded as having voted, and asked the GECOM to investigate this. It is based on the letters of allegation sent to GECOM that we now have before us, the letters that GECOM sent to the Chief Immigration Officer and the response of the Chief Immigration Officer, which adds up to evidence of the fact that people were out of the country at the time of poll, but their names are registered as names of persons for whom votes were cast. So we deal here purely with legal documents and statutory documents. The Chief Immigration Officer didn't have to wait on GECOM to have this information of who outed the country. He is, by law, supposed to have that information. And in fact, the law specifies, the National Registration Act Regulation 40 specifies that he may compile this information periodically and submit it to the Commission of National Registration for the commissioner to take pertinent action. So that this request for verification can even be seen in the context of the statutory function of the Chief Immigration Officer to periodically compile the names of those persons who have left the country and have not returned over an extended period, and to have it submitted to the Chief the Commissioner of National Registration. And I say that to say this. There is now an emerging argument by the chairman of GECOM that we shouldn't deal with this information, it's for a petition. But the law specifies that GECOM has an entitlement to this information and can take action, pertinent action, when information is made available.
And can self-regulate as well.
Right. Secondly, of interest is the fact that many more submissions were made by the APNU AFC, but for whatever reason, they were not sent for verification. It's only the first tranche that was sent for verification. The others were not sent. They were withheld. Thirdly, Nandalal and Jaglio and all of them are relying on the CARICOM report to say, well, CARICOM does not speak to this matter, and they were the ones who were in the recount. Let us check the date when these letters were sent to the Commissioner of Police. Let us check the date when they were returned. And let us check the date when the recount came to an end. And one would see that this information became available to the chairperson of GECOM whilst the recount was still ongoing. But obviously, this information was not made available to the CARICOM observer mission. Hence, they wrote in their report that they have no such knowledge. Them having no such knowledge does not mean that there was no such information, because all the dates here verifies that the information was available even when they were here, and it would have been an act, at minimum, of omission for the chairperson not to have told them that there was this occurrence.
For the benefit of our viewers, the letters sent by the chair of GECOM to the Office of the Commissioner of Police, who, again, I repeat, is a chief immigration officer. The first letter was sent on May 22nd, 2020, and the response...
May 27th.
The letter was sent on May 22nd, 2020, and the response was received, is dated rather, on 27th of May, 2020. The second letter was sent on May 31st, 2020, and the response was dated June 8th, 2020, all before the issue of the conclusion of the process and the CARICOM report being issued. Nandlal wrote to GECOM requesting the other lists of names that formed the basis for the request for an inquiry by the APNU AFC of the Commission. The other lists, there are two here. The other lists were requested by Mr. Nandlal and were received by him on the basis that he was going to follow up on the question of verification of the information. What has become of that?
So what we need to reiterate is that there were other lists which were not sent by the chairperson for verification. And one would ask, why not? The first list was sent and it says urgent action.
Yes.
No action has been taken to date. However, Nandalal came, I think it's about 2 years now, and demanded that all of the lists, those verified and those unverified, be handed over to his office. And he was very specific in that he was requiring this information so that he can prove the falsity of the accusation. So he wasn't being neutral in the exercise of his office. He started out by saying, this accusation is false. Give me the information and I am going to prove it is false. 2 years have elapsed and Nandalal has gone patently silent, but has that face, that bold face, to come and tell this nation that I am speaking without any evidence, when in fact, the evidence in relation to his knowledge is not hearsay. He has the evidence. I speak about it and I have it. He now suggests that what I'm speaking about is not true, although he has the evidence. He has the hundreds of names that have been verified, as we have been able to show the public here today, and the rest of the hundreds that were not sent for verification, which he said he would verify, and which he now has hidden somewhere and has become patently silent about, and attempts to tell the public that I am bizarre in what I am saying. And so there's a big question here of Nandalal's credibility and integrity as the Attorney General of this country to behaving in this manner when he is in fact the custodian of the evidence to the contrary of what he's seeking to tell the public.
Meanwhile, we still have brilliant people like what's his name? What Gill is it? Harry Gill, brilliant Harry Gill, asking us for our statements of poll when it is universally known that the original statements of poll are evidential material in an ongoing matter before the court.
All of which are in the possession of the court.
Exactly. So, brilliant, Mr. Harry Gill, you need to go back to singing calypsos. And maybe you can find one useful to sing about Nandlal in the way you sang promoting the late Winston Murray when you had different political ambitions. But that aside, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Nandlal is now dressed in a white robe with a halo over his head, playing a harp up in heaven somewhere as an angel. Tell us about the 47 boxes, ballot boxes on the East Coast with the missing statutory documents and what the implications of their inclusion in the recount were or are.
Well, again, this is a matter we need to clarify, because what Nandalal has said to the public is that there is a contention that there were 15,000, he mentioned, fraudulent votes. I don't know of that contention of 15,000 fraudulent votes. I know that during the recount, it was determined that the statutory documents for 47 boxes on the East Coast, area for which Nandalal superintended for the PPP, could not be sourced, could not be found. It means that in that forensic recount, those votes could not be validated because you did not have the documents which are used in the place of poll to cross off the names that documents which are then used at the end of poll to say there's so many names crossed off, there's so many ballots, and therefore these ballots are valid in keeping with the number of persons who turned up to vote. In the recount, those documents could not be found. And therefore, the validation of those votes became a question. Is it true that this is the number of persons who voted, or is it not true? That's the purpose a recount serves. Now, during that process, there was a court matter, and in that court matter, I think the judgment talked about only valid votes should be counted. In that regard, I think the chief elections officer proceeded to exclude from the count those votes on the contention that they were not validated during the process of the recount. The fact of the matter is, I did not take the same position as the chief elections officer. My contention was that these persons, they must have been persons who voted. And so, notwithstanding the absence of the documents of validation, you can't simply discard those votes. You had to go to another process that would allow people who did vote not to lose their franchise. And therefore, my proposition was a
By-election. I remember that
that
clearly.
will allow those persons to vote as you discard these questionable ballots, but to ensure that every Guyanese entitled to vote who was allowed to do so by virtue of a by-election. So Nananal again is dishonest when he says to the public that there was some contention that there were 15,000 fraudulent votes. There were 15,000 votes over which there were issues of validation. And in the interest of upholding the Constitution, my proposition was a by-election. That's documented. And copies of that document can be found, if they haven't destroyed them, in the National Library and in the University Library.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. I recently penned a letter to the media, print media carried it, and today there was a laughable response in the Guyana Chronicle, with which I will deal in coming days.
Did they carry a letter in the Chronicle?
They didn't.
But the response in the Chronicle?
But the response is in the Chronicle.
The rag.
And there is obviously panic in the PPP camp because they're hiding behind a unnamed, faceless staff writer. What they did not do is that they did not refute or dispute the claim that this is a stage being set for rigging, that they're in the process of rigging. So as the People's Progressive Party advances its massive rigging scheme, MRS, massive rigging scheme, remember it, we will continue this discussion and we will further flesh out the issue of that response to my letter in the Chronicle, and we'll give you some additional information as time goes by. But for now, that's all we have time for. Nation Watch today, Sunday, 3rd November 2024. Thank you again, Mr. Alexander, and thank our viewers for joining and staying with us the course of the program. Until we meet again, God bless you.